Hi, my name is Jordan King. I'm going to be giving you documentary analysis and course application presentation on the Freedom Riders. The Freedom Riders were a non-violent form of protest in the early 1960s that rode buses through the southern states such as Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. They did this to challenge segregation, which is the act of separating someone from something or something else or another. The Freedom Riders attracted violence to gain attention for their cause without retaliation, so they were a non-violent protest. The blacks in the southern state were experiencing segregation and it was causing structural strain, which we know from our class that is problems in society that cause people to become angry or frustrated. Seeking for a way to fix their issues, they organized a social movement, which is an organized effort to bring out social, political, or economic change. So they developed the Freedom Riders. The Freedom Riders organization operated under a reform movement which seeks to improve a society's current political, economical, or social state. And although their actions were quiet, they are still considered what we call a protest crowd, which gathers together to challenge the social, economic, or political status a society faces. So let's get to it. On May 4th, the Freedom Riders rallied and planned to travel towards Birmingham, Alabama, which was known as a very segregational state at the time. The first few days were very uneventful, much not like what they had expected. When they got to Atlanta, or when they were in Atlanta, there was a reception led by Martin Luther King Jr., the Reverend, where he did not join the Freedom Riders operation, which they had hoped for, but he did warn them about the Klan that was in Alabama and definitely warned them not to go. On May 14th, 2 buses were set to leave for Birmingham, Alabama. One was a Greyhound bus and one was a Trailways bus. Forsyth and Sons, a grocery store, had a surprise waiting for the Freedom Riders once they arrived. 200 plus people were waiting for the Freedom Riders to step foot off of that bus once they pulled into the station. They surrounded the bus, began to throw things at it, tried to destroy it, and were breaking the windows, slashing the tires, you name it. This type of crowd that we've read and discussed in class is known as an acting crowd because it shows aggressive behavior, destruction, violence, that sort of thing. This was about 15 minutes before the bus could move once it stopped in Birmingham, Alabama. Shortly after the departure, once they left Birmingham, the bus tires went flat and the first driver abandoned the bus and the Freedom Riders to fend for themselves. The rioters soon returned, started a fire on the bus, causing all of the riders to get out of the bus to avoid dying. The second Trailways bus, which had left the station roughly an hour after, had no idea what had happened to the Greyhound bus. And once the second bus had arrived, the KKK, or the Ku Klux Klan, was granted 15 minutes to cause as much damage as they wanted to the Freedom Riders without being arrested by the local police. After a few days and many arrests in Birmingham, the riders made it to Montgomery where they were to have protection from the police and finally felt some safety. But the tide quickly turned and the Freedom Riders were attacked in Montgomery by more than 300 people. Once again, we're noticing an acting crowd that commits violence and destruction. The police provided absolutely zero protection after Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, had gotten word from the local police force that they were going to protect the Freedom Riders during this process. That didn't happen. On May 5th, a meeting was called for a Freedom Rider support gathering at the First Baptist Church. Jim Farmer, Fred Shuttlesworth, and Martin Luther King all flew in to support this. There was more than 1,500 people in attendance. During the meeting, a mob formed outside of the church and began to throw rocks at the windows of the church. The U.S. Marshals were again sent by Robert Kennedy, along with National Guard troops, to protect the Freedom Riders. People had finally rejoiced that the Kennedys had finally taken a side and defended the civil rights movement and were backing them on their protest. On the 23rd of May, the Freedom Riders gathered in Dr. Harris's house, which he had a very nice big house in a very black community, which was a very uncommon thing at the time. Martin Luther King was in attendance, and many wanted him to ride with them again because of how important he was to the civil rights movement. But King refused. He was on probation, he says, even though many of the others were also on probation at the time, yet seemed to have no problem sticking their lives and jail time on the line. On the 24th, the day following, the Kennedys provided protection to the Freedom Riders to get them to the border of Alabama safely and into Jackson, Mississippi. 120 plus soldiers were sent to guard the Freedom Riders. Once they arrived in Jackson, the governor told the residents of the city to stay at home and no violence would be occurring in the city. The Freedom Riders were to obtain and to abide by the same laws that any citizen of the city would have done as well. However, the Freedom Riders got off the bus and they went to the white people only section, and basically they got in extreme trouble. They were arrested for not obeying the city laws, the segregation laws, and they were sent to Parchment Penitentiary, which is one of the most known worst prisons in the South at the time. They embraced the imprisonment and made the prison their new form of gathering for the civil rights movement. And over 200 riders, because they continued, the 200 riders, or more than 200 riders, were arrested in Jackson before Robert Kennedy finally called for a cooling off process. More than 200 riders were arrested and sent to this Parchment Penitentiary and were acting out in their civil rights movement. There were 430 or over 430 Freedom Riders. 300 of them ended up in the Parchment Penitentiary, all without using violence. Every one of these protesters did not use violence, and they still got their point across, were still arrested, and the ICC eventually ordered that there would be no more bus station segregation. So they accomplished their goal, they reached it, nobody died. They were a very successful protest, a very successful movement, and ultimately led to one of the biggest parts in social movements history that we know in the civil rights movement. That's all I have for you today. I thank you for listening. Have a great day.